Good afternoon, Nasdaq followers, and welcome to Times Square. We're right here at the Nasdaq market site, and it's 3 o'clock. That means that it's time for Behind the Bell. Joining us today in studio is Women in Technology as they celebrate their 30-year anniversary. Joining me right now is Parna Basu, VP of Marketing, and Rene Redwood, who is on the board of advisors at WITI. Thank you so much both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Here.
So, WITI is a foundation, an organization that has been supporting women in STEAM, that's technology careers, for 30 years now.
Right.
So congratulations. Could you tell us a little bit more about WITI?
Sure thing, and thank you. So WITI was founded by Carolyn Layton about 30 years ago, as you said, at a time when there were no organizations to support women in technology. And so since then, WITI now has a network of about 3 million people, both men and women in technology, as well as about 300 partners. And we have 60 networks, more than 60 networks around the world. So we've definitely grown from Carolyn coming up with that, with an idea of launching this organization, sitting at a coffee shop, to here we are celebrating 30 years.
That's incredible. Now, Rene, tell me a little bit about Carolyn Layton. I know that you are friends with her. Could you tell us a little bit more about her legacy?
Sure. I got to know Carolyn Layton upon the work I did with the Presidential Glass Ceiling Commission. The Civil Rights Act of 1991 established a bipartisan commission to look at the barriers that impede the advancement of women and minorities. Carolyn was one of the few people who actually reached out actively at the time of the commission to see what was needed in the area of technology to begin to abate the challenges that women in particular were facing as they sought to have careers in technology. She was committed, she had clarity of purpose, she recognized there was a gap in services and resources that were available to women who wanted to pursue careers in technology, whether it was science, technology, engineering, or math. And so she had the idea and started to float it around with folks. Having been a teacher, she felt it was important that there was a lot of learnings that women were not having access to relative to the industry. And so even when women had degrees in science, engineering, technology, they weren't having access to the networks that gave them entree to even just entry-level positions, much less being able to move up the organization pipeline. She continued, once the commission was done with its work and put forward recommendations, WITI and Carolyn was one of the organizations that actually took these recommendations and said, how do we make them real? How do we make them available to institutions, to corporations, to entrepreneurs, to businesses, so that they could begin to really see some positive movement of including women in the industry, in that sector of technology. She has been steadfast with a vision of a fully participatory and inclusive industry. She has been very, very, very clear on the import of women in technology as a critical asset in order to grow the industry, but also to identify critical utility of technology. And so she has just been a long time activist, advocate, visionary, and a visionary that actually could put into play the vision, right? Moving beyond policy and principle to actual practices within organizations.
Absolutely, and that's very important to recognize, given that a lot of these issues that you mentioned are still so relevant today.
Yeah.
So, Parna, could you tell us, another mission that WITI has is gender inclusivity. How is that going to manifest itself in years to come, and how is it manifesting itself now?
Right, that's a great question. So WITI will continue to support women in technology, but now we are also working with companies to really see how we can create and foster a gender neutral, gender inclusive, inclusive culture. And again, we know that, in this world, the population is 50% men and 50% women. We all have sons and brothers and husbands and co-workers, so we have to work with men no matter where we are. And it's in our relationships to co-working. We also know that when you bring men and women together in a workplace, you get really great innovative products because you're getting the best of both worlds. Therefore, the companies are actually benefiting from bringing them together and from their smarts. And our vision right now, or I should say Carolyn's vision right now working with us, is how do we bring that that inclusivity into the workforce. A lot of companies need help and guidance in how to build that inclusivity, how to foster the inclusivity, and that's one of the things that you'll be hearing a lot of coming 2019 and beyond.
Now, Rene, as we mentioned, a lot of these topics that you mentioned earlier are still so relevant, yes, right? So there are several stats that show the lack of representation of women in tech, but there's one in particular that stood out as I was doing research for this interview. Of the women in the tech industry, only around 1/5 hold technical roles. And when you start looking at retention, that number is also not great.
Right.
So in your eyes, what do we do to close that gap?
A couple of things we need to do to close the gap. I think, let me just take a moment to talk about this pin here, the glass ceiling pin. Where Carolyn is also one of the women who have one of the very early versions of this pin. Part of closing the gap is the notion of how do we break these glass ceilings? How do we break these barriers? How do we change organizational cultures to be welcoming and respecting and valuing of women in particular in the industry? We know that based on the work of the Commission as well as practices, best and promising practices that are being put in play right now to create greater inclusive environments, it starts from the top. So what we say is leadership commitment. Are organizations, are the heads of organizations committed to inclusion? Are they committed to trying to tap the talent that resides in the workforce? Are managers being held accountable for active outreach and recruitment of women and communities of color, and individuals have historically been left out of this industry? Are there mentoring programs in place? You talked about, well, 1/5 of the women in the industry are actually in technical positions. Part of that challenge happens is when the culture is not welcoming and people don't see themselves as having opportunities to move forward, they move out. So we're seeing an increased number of women entrepreneurs in this industry because the existing infrastructures are not viable for them. They don't have growth opportunities. One of the challenges that we see consistently, and as you said, we had the same thing back in 1991 when the glass ceiling was established as part of the Civil Rights Act, we see the same things right now. What we would call a societal barrier, biases, prejudice that deny individuals the ability to bring the fullness of who they are. Preconceived notions of what women and others can do without giving people fair opportunity to show their talent and their skills. So there's a host of things. One of the other things we're looking at very aggressively, and I know a lot of folks have heard about it, is the Rene rule. The Rene rule is about creating diverse candidate slates. It was a rule that was put in place with the NFL, which is why it's named Rene. And it said that in order to have coaches that were diverse, that you had to have diverse candidate pools. And that it needed to be something that didn't just happen by random, but that was by design. And so we know that many of the remedies and the solutions to minimize and abate the gaps and the barriers have to be very deliberate. It isn't something that you just kind of hope. There needs to be real concrete, measurable, we talk about SMART goals, right? Strategic and measurable goals in order to be able to achieve an inclusive workforce that brings the talent of the best and the brightest and then keeps them within the organization. Those are some of the things that need to continue to happen both in technology as well as in other industries. And I would also say that the hashtag #MeToo moment that we're in right now is also an indicator that women are no longer being silent about the lack of opportunity. One of the challenges we've seen in technology is that you might have 1 or 2 women and they're isolated. Part of what WITI has done was create networks, create a sense of community, that you're not alone. The same thing with the Me Too, that you're not alone. And this is part of why I believe we're actually going to see more and more women in technology because of access, because of women speaking up, saying to professors at universities, I can learn this. Don't tell me that. I was told when I was in prep school that the only reason I was taking chemistry and science was so that I could bake better.
Wow.
Okay, and I'm a chemist by training. And now girls and women can see too few role models, but there are role models.
Now, Rene, you said something that I want to follow up on. You said that there are more women entrepreneurs who are stepping away from the industry as an institution and creating their own businesses, their own entrepreneurship ventures because the system does not cater to them.
That's right.
Now, in generations moving forward, do you see that still being the case, or how do you see the technology industry building a more inclusive space for women and women of color, women, no matter however they identify in terms of sexuality? How do you see that future looking like?
Corporations and institutions that don't embrace and value the talent will find themselves in competition, right? Either you create an environment where people can bring their innovative ideas, their different perspectives, new ways of thinking, or people go out and start their own competition to the existing industries, right? You don't have to have a huge corporation in order to get a solution for the challenges that face us as a society. And so I think part of this, it really always goes to the business bottom line. Are companies willing to change and see women, women of color, communities of color as assets? Not just as a market to sell to, but even then, your market may be limited if you're not bringing the perspectives and the needs of those communities to bear. And so I do think that part of the movement towards entrepreneurship is, again, a backlash to institutions that have historically denied that access. People don't have to be denied anymore. If you can't find your way within a corporation, you know what? There's other opportunities out there. Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing on that with women entrepreneurship, and particularly in this industry, access to capital. That is a huge barrier. It's a huge barrier on being able to have the capital to grow your business. And again, as we see more women in finance, right? Again, it's just kind of like it rolls.
It's an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Nothing rolls alone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nothing
And
operates.
I think to that point, now we have these VC firms that's growing.
That will cater
Yeah, exactly.
That's
They'll
right.
just cater to the women entrepreneurs, and that's phenomenal. And we hope that more of those will come along.
Right. Either play with us or we play against you.
I'm
this is called team. Competition. There's a lot of talent out there. Industries are finding themselves having to compete with a smaller cadre of businesses who are much more agile, more innovative, creative, more open and receptive to new ideas, willing to go to the ground to find out what are the needs.
Right.
Right?
Absolutely. Now, Parna, as we wrap up here, could you tell us what is in store for 2019 with WITI? I mean, 30 years strong. What can we expect next?
Well, there's a lot of exciting things planned for WITI next year and beyond. A couple of things is, we will be adding more networks globally, so that's in the works. We are also celebrating 25th anniversary of our Hall of Fame in 2019. We've inducted, I think about more than 130 women have been inducted in the Hall of Fame, so this will be, 2019 will be the 5th year. We'll also be launching a program to inspire students community. So they are the future innovators, and that's something that's in the works as well. So there's a ton of stuff happening at WITI. We hope that more people will come join us and help change the world, make the world a terrific place for the future innovators who are getting ready to enter the workforce.
Such a crucial mission statement.
It is.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Parna, and thank you, Rene. Thank you for joining us, and I will see you at the closing bell in just a few minutes.
You got it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nasdaq followers, please stay tuned for more coverage right here from the Nasdaq market site. WITI will be ringing the closing bell in just a few minutes.